So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us on Cinco de Mayo, and hopefully you guys learn a thing or two about this holiday, this important historical date, and why it's important to us and why we celebrate it. I feel like growing up, I as a Mexican American, I thought it wasn't a big deal, but the older I got and the more I learned about its historical importance, the more relevant and important it seemed. So my name is Jose Martinez. I do education at the Mexic-Arte Museum in Austin, Texas. And joining me is Profe.
Dr. George Vargas, bienvenidos, welcome, ciao, shalom. Curator and Director of Special Programs at Mexic-Arte Museum. Welcome one and all to our presentation today. Jose and the professor present another valuable lesson in American culture.
And the narrations on this presentation are by my partner who no longer works for the museum, but she did a great job, and she created this, she did the research, the presentation, she created all of this, and she's narrating it. Her name is Paulina Dos Terminel, and that will be her voice behind every slide we will be hearing here. So let's go ahead and begin. I'm going to share my screen with everyone. And here we go. So, Cinco de Mayo.
La Batalla de Puebla and the legacy of Cinco de Mayo was brought to you by Mexic-Arte Museum. This project is supported in part by the Cultural Arts Division of the City of Austin Economic Development Department. This exhibit is made possible in part by a grant from Humanities Texas, the state affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities.
All right.
Mexic-Arte Museum is dedicated to cultural enrichment and education through the collection, preservation, and presentation of traditional and contemporary Mexican, Latino, and Latin American art and culture to promote dialogue and develop understanding for visitors of all ages. How did Cinco de Mayo, a Mexican battle against the French, become a popular celebration in the United States today? Cinco de Mayo, or 5th of May, is an annual celebration commemorating the Mexican Army's victory over the French Empire at the Battle of Puebla on May 5, 1862. Although often confused with Mexican Independence Day, Cinco de Mayo celebrates a Mexican victory in one battle that thwarted the French invasion for another year.
All right, so that's the first clearing of misconceptions. It's not Mexican Independence Day.
Yes, and I'd like to add something to your comment. There are many misconceptions or lack of awareness about this celebration, Cinco de Mayo. Yes, it's celebrated by Mexican and Mexican-American people and other Latino peoples in Mexico and the United States. However, it's also an American celebration. So this is part of our American history and our American culture, because more and more Americans in mainstream United States are observing
important dates leading up to the Battle of Puebla.
All right. Sorry, I accidentally clicked on that guy, but important dates.
No problem.
La Guerra de la Independencia, from 1810 to 1821. La Guerra de la Independencia, or the Mexican War of Independence. Independence Day, September 16th, celebrates the day Miguel Hidalgo made the cry of independence, known as El Grito de la Independencia, in the town of Dolores, Guanajuato, to motivate people to revolt against the Spanish regime. Mexico's independence was not actually obtained until September 28, 1821.
Now, we also are going to be looking at and sometimes explaining some of the artwork that we see, for example, in this particular slide. this print by Angel Bracho, Grito de Independencia. In other words, it refers back to Miguel Hidalgo's cry for independence. And this particular artist, like many other Mexican printmakers, a very important member of Taller Gráfica Popular, a very important school or studio for Mexican printmakers who address these different battles and wars toward eventual liberation for the Mexican peoples. And here we have the Catholic priest, Hidalgo, leading the people against the state, the military, and the church. And you also see a man holding, or actually the priest holding a rope, of course, that will ring the bell of liberation. But first, of course, you have to resist the powers that be. And the rope, of course, symbolizes the hangman's rope by which los indios and other pobres were hung.
And the indios being the indigenous people of Mexico, and pobres being, of course, the poor in Mexico. Now, I just want to make a quick comment on the prints. I know we, as an art museum, right, we have many, many prints such as these from all periods of Mexican history. And I just want to point out that they're not drawings, they're not ink drawings, they're actually more like a stamp. So everything that is white has been carved out, either of wood or a piece of linoleum. Linoleum is kind of like that rubbery stuff that they use for flooring, for tile at schools and other offices and things like that, but a more specialized print version of it. So I just want you guys to keep that in mind as you see the exquisite details on the faces and all the other little things, because everything was carved out with special tools, and then they use it to print multiple copies of them.
And that's a very good point. If I might follow up, the print medium is a very critical medium for artists engaged in the revolution or the struggle, if you will. And there are multiple copies that can be distributed very easily. And most of these artists in Mexico did not take payment for their work. And of course, they usually didn't take payment for their prints. And this is the way we get the medium, the message out toward this medium. It's spontaneous, it's effective, and of course, it's through the art medium that helps to tell the story, if you will. Many people at that time in Mexico are illiterate, so they can easily read the message contained here in the print.
Following Mexican Independence Day, we have the Mexican-American War.
The Mexican-American War, from 1846 to 1848. The Mexican-American War, also known in the United States as the Mexican War and in Mexico as the American Intervention in Mexico, was an armed conflict between the United States of America and the Second Federal Republic of Mexico from 1846 to 1848. It pitted a politically divided and militarily unprepared Mexico against the expansionist-minded administration of U.S. President James K. Polk, who believed the United States had a manifest destiny to spread across the continent to the Pacific Ocean. Mexico was forced to sell 54% of its land holdings to the United States for $15 million. Gold was discovered in California just 3 days prior to Mexico ceding the territory.
Real quick points that I'd like to make right here. I'd like to underscore the fact that this idea of manifest destiny was hammered out just months before the invasion by the American forces into Mexico that started out the Mexican-American War. And this idea is tied to the God-given right of the United States to spread democracy and imperialism throughout North America and later the rest of the Americas. After the war, the Treaty of Guadalupe de Hidalgo forced Mexico to give over present-day Southwest. The states included Arizona, California, Colorado, Nevada, New Mexico, Texas, Utah, and Wyoming. So that's a pretty good deal that the United States made for a paltry $15 million. And the other thing that's important here, ladies and gentlemen, is that according to the treaty, the people that lived on these lands and owned these lands, Spaniards, Mexicanos, Mexican Americans, Indians, and others, were allowed by the treaty to keep their land, practice their culture, their religion, as well as anything else that they were doing prior to the war. However, that treaty was ignored or just totally trampled upon by the land grabbers afterwards, who came in and took away these lands that were guaranteed to these people through the treaty.
Yeah, so I guess the key takeaway here is that it's common knowledge to us in the Southwest and Texas, but a lot of people do not know that Arizona, California, Colorado, Nevada, New Mexico, Texas, Utah, and Wyoming belong to Mexico, and the U.S. took them away.
The The War of Reform, from 1857 to 1860. The War of Reform in Mexico during the Second Federal Republic of Mexico was the 3-year civil war between members of the Mexican Liberal Party attempting to implement democracy and members of the Conservative Party resisting the legitimacy of that government and its radical restructuring of Mexican laws, known as La Reforma, the Reform. The conservatives controlled the capital and much of central Mexico, while the rest of the states had to choose whether to side with the conservative government or the liberal government of Benito Juarez and Mexican Army General Ignacio Zaragoza. While the conservative forces lost the war, guerrillas, or small wars, remained active in the countryside for years to come, and conservatives in Mexico would conspire with French forces to install Maximilian I as emperor during the following French intervention in Mexico. At the end of this war, Mexico's army and economy was left depleted. The fleeing conservative officials had not only emptied the treasury, but had seized foreigners' property and taken out loans with foreign banks in Spain, England, and France.
Here we have another print of Benito Juarez, who we will talk about in a moment.
Mexico's post-war debt, 1861. Mexico's post-war debt offered the perfect excuse for invasion. Taking advantage of the relative weakness of the United States during the U.S. Civil War, in December of 1861, the governments of France, Great Britain, and Spain landed an allied military force at the port of Veracruz, Mexico, after the Convention of London. Benito Juarez negotiated with the Allies and promised to resume payments, and the British and Spanish troops began to withdraw from Mexico. Napoleon III, however, had decided to conquer Mexico for France and re-establish an empire in the West, while simultaneously stopping American westward expansion in the process. Among the motivations of the French was to weaken the United States by supporting the Confederacy with their first-class army after gaining a foothold in Mexico. In a letter to his superiors, French Army General Lorenzes boasted that the French soldiers enjoy such racial and organizational superiority over the Mexicans that with this 6,000 men, I will control all of Mexico.
All right. Key takeaways.
It's very important to note here that the French were very liberal-minded. Under Napoleon III, there was much reform in France at that particular time. So you would think that Napoleon would keep his hands off of Mexico, who's struggling for their own independence. That's not the case here. Napoleon wanted to expand the French Empire and established the second Mexican empire in Mexico. And in the backdrop as well is the Civil War, the impending Civil War, in which Texas, a new state of the Confederacy, a slave state. So you have these Confederate states that are slave states. You have Mexico that has outlawed slavery. And ironically, you have the French also having outlawed slavery in Europe. So it's a great contradiction that we see among these particular foreign powers.
Yeah, so his greed got the best of him, right? He wanted to make Mexico another France and stop the US and basically support the Confederacy, which was fighting for slavery in the US. And this is why I think Cinco de Mayo is super important. So now we'll talk about the important figures behind Cinco de Mayo. First and foremost, Benito Juarez. Let's hear it.
Benito Juarez, 1806 to 1872. Benito Pablo Juarez Garcia was a Mexican lawyer and president of Mexico, of Zapotec origin from Oaxaca. He was of poor, rural, indigenous origin, but he became a well-educated urban professional and politician who married a woman of Oaxaca City, Margarita Maza. He identified primarily as a liberal and wrote only briefly about his indigenous heritage. Juarez's political rise was a continual struggle to transform his liberal ideas of economic capitalism and separation of church and state into a permanent political reality and to overcome the prevalent social attitudes toward his indigenous background. His domestic laws of reform set the stage for Mexico's remarkable modernization in the last quarter of the 19th century and freed Mexico from the most flagrant remnants of neocolonialism. His leadership against the French earned Juarez his place as a national hero.
So, real quick, things that I personally resonate with me from Benito Juarez is he was of Zapotec origin, right? Which means he was indigenous, he came from indigenous origins. And I think that's always a major irony, is that from America, we always look at Mexico and its government as being kind of, I don't know, being like a first generation immigrant, Mexican-American. I feel like the attitude is always that Mexico kind of is inferior government-wise, politics-wise to the US, but here we have a president from indigenous origin, which America has never had. They've never had black, well, they have Obama, black president, but I mean like indigenous people that they owed a lot of their success to. And here comes Benito. He learns the ways of politics and creates all this progress for Mexico. And
yes, he was short of stature, as a lot of Mexicanos are, but he became a giant of a man. He was there in Mexico at the right time, taking advantage of this opportunity to develop this leadership and move Mexico forward, especially against the French invasion.
Ignacio Zaragoza, another hero.
Ignacio Zaragoza, 1829 to 1862. Ignacio Zaragoza has a special place in Mexico and Texas history. Usually favoring spectacles and a black civilian suit, Brigadier General Ignacio Zaragoza looked more like a young professor than a Mexican general. He had been born into the army, though not into one of the criollo, Mexican-born Spanish military families. Rather, his father had been a sergeant in the garrison at Presidio La Bahía del Espíritu Santo. His mother was a San Antonio native. He not only originated in Goliad, Texas, when Texas was Mexico, and claimed relations with Tejanos from the colonial period, but he began his military career in the Monterrey-Saltillo area and married a young woman from Monterrey. He was truly Mexican by choice. 5 years after the Mexican-American War, Zaragoza decided that he had a military calling. During the War of the Reform, he was promoted for his part in the liberals' victories, and by 1860, when the conservative forces were decisively defeated and the 3-year war was formally ended, Zaragoza had defeated in battle every leading conservative general. In 1861, Juarez named him Secretary of War and Navy. In preparation for the famous Battle of Puebla, General Zaragoza recruited around 500 Tejano cowboys from the Jim Wells County area of South Texas, who served as cavalrymen in the fight against the French intervention, even in the months and years following that actual battle. Texas cemented his memory as an iconic trans-border and transnational hero against foreign aggression by establishing the General Zaragoza State Historic Site near Goliad, Texas. Soon after the Battle of Puebla, and before the French had advanced on Mexico City, President Juarez hosted a celebration of Zaragoza as a national hero. The president had also declared May 5, 1862, a national holiday and changed the name of Puebla de Los Angeles to Puebla de Zaragoza. Shortly after his famous victory, Zaragoza was struck by typhoid fever, of which he died at the age of 33. He was buried in San Fernando Cemetery in Mexico City. He was later exhumed and transferred to Puebla, while his former tomb became a monument.
So Ignacio Zaragoza, we have a woodcut of him right here. So you can see the battles in the back. He's a kind of war genius and teamed up with Juarez to, I think what I love about Zaragoza is that he was like a Chicano before Chicano was a thing, since he was born in Texas before it was America. He basically got to see the crazy changes that Texas went through becoming from Mexico to American state, and still was able to round up Tejano cowboys, as it says right here, to help Mexico fight their war, which I think it's a beautiful thing, because Mexicans and minorities have always been fighting American wars kind of by force, and here is the other side of that, where Americans are helping Mexicans by choice, right?
I think that's a great point that you made, that so-called Americans or U.S. citizens engaged the enemy on behalf of Mexico in these different battles, even up to the Mexican Revolution. Americans were providing arms and other things to the Mexicanos in their battle to ultimately win their freedom in the Mexican Revolution.
Yeah, and you got to keep in mind, 500 doesn't sound like much, but also keep in mind the time. It's when the South was against the North, right? The Civil War. So Texas is a state of the South, and finding people that are willing to fight against the South in a way, you know, like for Mexico, while there's the war going on for them as well. It's pretty amazing. All right. Battle of Puebla. So this is the Battle of Puebla for the battle that happened on Cinco de Mayo, and we're going to hear Paulina talk about it a little bit more.
The Battle of Puebla. France's intervention in Mexico was the first phase in Louis Napoleon's grand design, a scheme that had been conceived during Louis's long exile in England and the United States. Napoleon III's design envisioned Paris as the political hub, with Rome the religious hub of a cultural, commercial, and religious empire uniting all the Catholic nations of Europe. Latin America, a term Napoleon III coined, was a critical part of his so-called Latin League. With a new canal in Mexico or Central America to complement the Suez Canal already being built with French investment, the League would dominate world trade. In 1862, over 6,000 French troops landed at Veracruz, intending to reach the capital of Mexico City. The French advance was along a route that had been used several times in the past to conquer Mexico, first by the Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés, and most recently by U.S. General Winfield Scott during the Mexican-American War. On May 5, 1862, near the city of Puebla, the outnumbered Mexican army held their ground defending two forts, Guadalupe and Loreto, resulting in over 500 French deaths and a retreat. The Mexican victory at Puebla against a much better equipped and larger French army provided a significant morale boost to the Mexican army and also helped slow the French's advance to Mexico City. So newspapers throughout the country ran headlines intending to spread the message of national unity and hope. The battle was also one of the first to be telegraphed, not only domestically in real time, but even going so far as the United States. Zaragoza's success at the Battle of Puebla on May 5th represented a great symbolic victory for the Mexican government and bolstered the resistance movement. An important significance of the Battle of Puebla is that up until this point in history, there had been no official Mexican army, national Mexican army. During the War of Reform, the Confederate Army was drafted or pardoned for prison time or debt to fight in the war. The army that defeated the French at Puebla was made up of volunteer brigades from different Mexican states. There was also the indigenous peoples of the northern Sierra highlands of Zacopaxtla, Tetetla, and Xochicapulco, and other Nahuas. It was the first time the country came together as an independent nation fighting for sovereignty. Most of them were recently recruited and untried in battle. Before battle, General Zaragoza told them simply, "Our enemies may be the world's best soldiers, but you are the best sons of Mexico, and they want to seize our country from you. Today, you are going to fight for a sacred objective. You are going to fight for the motherland, and I promise that this day we shall triumph in a day of eternal renown. I see victory in your faces. Let us have faith. Viva la independencia nacional. Viva Mexico. Long live national independence. Long live Mexico." The soldiers enthusiastically echoed the call.
This is another fine example of David versus Goliath. On the right hand, you've got the ragtag army of the Mexicanos confronting and eventually defeating the bigger and better armed French army. In the center, you've got Juarez holding the tricolor flag of Mexico. Also in the bottom, you see women and children. Families supported their soldiers by actually marching with them into these battles and into the war and giving them great moral support, as well as feeding them and taking care of their wounds and so forth. And especially in the Mexican Revolution, you'll have women guerrilla fighters that rise to the occasion.
Yeah, and so, yeah, that, like Paulina was saying, and I remember even when she was doing the research, she would kind of talk to me like she was amazed that she'd be finding out all these awesome facts about the battle, like that the French army had horses and had all these cannons, as you can see here. And a lot of times the Mexican soldiers were just kind of setting traps and throwing boulders from like the mountains and kind of things like you see in movies. But this was really how they won. So of course, after they won, they felt like they could invincible, like they could do anything.
Yes, and today we've got a similar type of confrontation where the giant, that is the United States of America, was defeated in Vietnam, and certainly in Afghanistan, the giant, again, the United States of America, has not really won the war there.
Yeah, could do a whole nother presentation on that one.
Later.
All right. So the aftermath after the Battle of Puebla is won. What were the effects? Let's hear it.
Emperor Maximiliano and Empress Carlota. The following year, after the Battle of Puebla, the French returned with a much larger army of 40,000 men. Under a new commander, they took Puebla in a 3-month siege and marched unopposed into Mexico City to seat Maximilian on his long-awaited throne. Zaragoza did not live to see it, having died of typhoid 4 months after the Battle of Puebla. Maximiliano and his wife Charlotte, to be known as Carlota, arrived in Mexico believing that they had the support of the Mexican people. But nationalism in Mexico was running high. Maximilian was too liberal for the conservative Mexicans who supported the monarchy and lost the support of the Papal Nuncio, the envoy representing the Pope, when he declared freedom of religion. In the summer of 1867, after heavy American diplomatic and military pressure, Napoleon III brought his last troops home, consigning Maximilian to the Mexican firing squad and his own grand design for the Americas to history.
Yeah, so again, right, first they show up with 6,000, Cinco de Mayo, La Battle of Puebla, they lose, and then they come back a year later with 40,000. And now they force their way into Mexico. They bring Maximiliano and Carlota here to be emperors of Mexico. But again, in this, it's probably my favorite print because it's so detailed. And again, all the white is carved out, and it's basically a big stamp. You see the people, it's called El Pueblo Responde, which translates to literally to the town responds, but the town represents the people respond. You can see them, they're still, as Paulina said, nationalism is running high. They just fended off the French army, and here they're saying Viva Juarez. They still believe Juarez is their true leader, even though the French are trying to come in and say that they're the ones leading now. And you see all the paper, they're kind of shutting doors on them and things like that. So.
Yes, and this particular artist, Alberto Beltran, also member of TGP, Taller Gráfica Popular, a very important, significant printmaker, and some would claim that he is as important to Mexican art as Jose Posada. That particular carriage that we see is now preserved and on display in the castle of Chapultepec in Mexico. So if you wanted to see it, you can travel to Mexico and actually see this emperor's carriage.
Okay, so the significance, right? Why is it so important? More so, as Dr. Vargas was saying, it's also part of American history. Why do we celebrate it more in America than in Mexico?
The French Society of Remembrance, 1896. In 1896, under a petition started by the French Society of Remembrance, the bodies of all French and Mexican soldiers who fought in the Battle of Puebla and later during the French intervention were relocated and buried with honors at the French cemetery in Puebla City. At the top of the mausoleum is a bronze sculpture by a French master, which depicts the Angel of Liberty flanked by a French soldier and Porfirio Diaz in his Mexican general uniform, handing the branch of victory to the latter. This gift from the French was a symbolic restoration of the bonds of friendship between countries, as well as a symbol of healing for the Republic of Mexico.
And now we're going to look at that mausoleum.
Well, actually, it's more of an actual monument. That's the title. That's incorporated in the title. The French have a great tradition of this kind of statuary or the building of these monuments, especially during and after the French Revolution. The French artists produced great statues like what we see here. In the center is this allegorical figure, this angel of peace. On the left is a French soldier, and on the right is the Mexican general in his uniform. The angel holds an olive branch of peace above the general. This symbolizes unity, peace, and reconciliation.
All right, so celebrations, how we celebrate it. Let's hear from Paulina while we look at this.
Within Mexico, Cinco de Mayo is primarily observed in the state of Puebla, where Zaragoza's unlikely victory occurred, although other parts of the country also take part in the celebration. Traditions include military parades, recreations of the Battle of Puebla, and other festive events. In the United States, Cinco de Mayo is widely interpreted as a celebration of Mexican culture and heritage, particularly in areas with substantial Mexican-American populations. Chicano activists raised awareness of the holiday in the 1960s, in part because they identified with the victory of indigenous Mexicans, such as Juarez, over European invaders during the Battle of Puebla. Today, revelers mark the occasion with parades, parties, mariachi music, Mexican folk dancing, and traditional foods such as tacos and mole poblano. Some of the largest festivals are held in Los Angeles, Chicago, Houston, and Austin, Texas for Mexic-Arte Museum's Taste of Mexico.
And you see Zaragoza on the right at the top above the other figures. This is a mural by Duran, and we'll talk more about Duran in the next slide. And
Yeah.
what's important here is that in the 1960s, Chicano activists really celebrated Cinco de Mayo as learning about this celebration because they are, of course, Mexicanos. And so they spread this celebration throughout the United States until the 1980s during the era of the Hispanics when it was commercialized. But of course, that's to our advantage because it becomes a mainstream celebration and part of American culture. The thing about the Chicano movement of the 60s and 70s is that they were trying to make three particular points. That is self-identity. We will call ourselves what we want to, Chicano, Mexican American, Latino, Hispanic, whatever it may be. And self-determination. Chicano peoples will determine our own fate, our own destiny. And thirdly, as important as anything else, is equity. Equity in education and equity in employment.
So again, we are in Austin, Texas. So we wanted to highlight how Cinco de Mayo has had an effect here in Austin, and Paulina will talk about it.
Puebla City donated a bust and monumental plaque to Zaragoza.
Technical difficulty.
I chose to focus on patriotic Mexican heroes, and Ignacio Zaragoza, whom the park is named for, is a central image.
And again, what she's talking about is
Within Mexico, Cinco de
and what you see here is also the park, Zaragoza Park here in Austin, and people just kind of celebrating Cinco de Mayo, right? And like she said, Duran focused on Zaragoza as well. Okay. So that is it for Cinco de Mayo on our behalf. If you guys have any questions, we're about to answer them right now. If you have any questions beyond what we can answer right now, such as using this PowerPoint or having access to it, you can email us at the email, and these are our handles for Instagram, for the museum Instagram and the education Instagram as well. So please write those down if you haven't already, and we will begin taking questions. See what we got.
And here's our sponsors, by the way.
That is right, our sponsors. So all this was brought to you by, part by Cultural Arts Division of the City of Austin Economic Development Department. It was also by a grant from the Humanities Texas, and of course the City of Austin. So now we will begin.
Questions and comments, please. Questions and comments.
Let's see. So let's see. Class. Okay. Any questions? No. That is off.
Which art are you speaking about? The prints are relief prints, either made on wood or on linoleum. They're called relief prints. The mural that you saw is painted on a wall. And Duran is a very popular muralist here in Austin and throughout Texas.
We have a question here. Was Simón Bolívar in the Franco-Mexican War?
I'm not aware of that. I couldn't say. Bolivar was a great leader in South America. Also, just like Zaragoza, fighting imperialism and tyranny.
Have another one. How old was Zaragoza when he fought in the war?
I don't know that. I couldn't tell you. I think he died in his early 30s. He was a very young man.
Yeah.
And it's sad that he went out not on a battlefield, but defeated by a disease, somewhat like what we have today with this terrible pandemic plague that impacts our society.
Rita wants to know, what did they use in the wars? I don't know what you mean. What did they use? In what sense?
What kind of weapons? Well, the French had the most advanced rifles as well as the heavier cannons. And the Mexican army, if you call it an army, the ragtag army, had a mishmash of different arms. Some of them even carried pitchforks and clubs and knives and machetes into the battle against the French.
Shovels to throw boulders off mountains. What other battles against the French were there besides the Battle of Puebla?
Well, there was the other battles that were fought after Puebla by the French, and that was really the only other battle that was fought afterwards because the Mexican forces were soundly defeated and could not recuperate to fight against the French. And of course, leadership was dissolving quickly as they faced a much larger army of Napoleon.
All right. So, I'll take a last question if anyone has anything else we didn't answer.
Now, we also have to point out that the French were our friends. They helped us in the Battle of New Orleans to defeat the enemy there when the United States needed a foreign power to help them. You also have to recall that the Statue of Liberty, the famous statue that we have in New York City, was gifted to the United States by the French government. And sometimes we forget that the French are our friends and have been, except in this case, when they invaded Mexico.
Yes. So what type of guns did the Mexican use? We already answered that. With bayonets, yeah, with the knives attached to it. They had those too. Was Napoleon III, Napoleon Bonaparte?
Well, there were many, yes, there were many Napoleons. And he was one of three, and perhaps the most famous of them all, especially because of his decisive victories, but also because of his reforms in education and in law and so forth back in France. So good guy, bad guy.
Okay, so that is all for questions. Thank you guys very much for tuning in. Hope you learned a thing or two and why it is worth celebrating Cinco de Mayo. I feel my personal, if you had to write something on your homework to what did you learn, or it would be that if Cinco de Mayo had been lost, maybe the Confederacy would have won the Civil War in America and slavery would have gone on longer than it originally did. So that's a big thing amongst others. All right, thank you guys for tuning in.
Thank you.
See you guys on the next one, and yeah, follow us on social media. And if you're ever in Austin, visit us. We're downtown.
Happy Cinco de Mayo.
Cinco de Mayo. Goodbye.